The final slam of the door was a sound as absolute as a nail in a coffin. 16-year-old Elara stood on the porch, the wood vibrating against her back, and did not turn around. She had watched her father weaken, his breath growing shallow as the autumn chill deepened, and now that he was gone, his second wife, a woman with a heart as barren as a salt flat, had wasted no time. The law was on her side. The farm was hers. Elara was not. "The law says I owe you nothing," her stepmother had declared, her voice devoid of any warmth. "But for the sake of your father's memory, I'll not send you out with empty hands." She had pressed 10 silver dollars into Elara's palm, the coins cold and heavy. Beside them she placed a folded deed. And this, his greatest foolishness. A worthless plot of rock up on the Whisperwind Ridge. He called it his just-in-case land. Now it's yours. Elara clutched the coins and the paper. She had nothing else. The clothes she wore, her father's worn axe leaning against the porch rail, and the deed. The entire community of Promise Creek had gathered, drawn by the quiet drama of an orphan's expulsion. They stood in silent, awkward clumps, their faces a mixture of pity and relief that this was not their trouble. Their silence was its own kind of judgment, a collective turning away. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, and a man whose opinions were as solid as the foundation of his store, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, a sound of dry authority. "Now, Elara," he began, his tone condescendingly kind, "there's no sense in this foolishness. That land is a collapsed ice house on a stone bluff. Nothing grows there. It's a hole in the ground. You come work for me. I need a girl to sweep and clean. You'll have a roof over your head." The offer hung in the air, thick with the smell of charity. It was a sensible path, a safe one. It was also a surrender. Elara looked at his face, at the faces of the other townspeople, and saw her future laid out for her. The forgotten girl, the pitiable orphan, living on scraps of kindness until she faded into the background of their lives. She shook her head once, a small, sharp movement. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "No, thank you, Mr. Gable." She turned and walked not toward the mercantile, but into it. The bell above the door chimed, a lonely sound in the sudden silence. Inside, she laid her silver dollars on the counter. She did not buy a stagecoach ticket east. She bought a shovelhead, 20 pounds of salt, a small sack of seed potatoes, and a whetstone. When she emerged, the crowd parted for her. She walked to the porch, picked up her father's axe, and without a backward glance, she turned her back on Promise Creek. She faced the rising hills and the gray, unforgiving sky, and began to walk. The town watched until she was just a small figure, shrinking against the vast, indifferent landscape. A girl walking toward a hole in the ground that everyone knew was worthless. The journey to Whisperwind Ridge was a punishment. The road dissolved into a rutted track, then a faint trail that clawed its way through dense, thorny scrub and fields of stone. Every step was a battle against the land itself. The shovelhead was a dead weight in one hand, the axe a clumsy burden in the other. The sack of salt and potatoes dug into her shoulder, a constant, nagging pain. The autumn air, crisp in the valley, grew a sharper edge here, a wind that sliced through her thin coat like a knife. She walked for the better part of a day, the sun a pale wafer in a sky the color of slate. The world grew quiet, the sounds of the town fading, until all she could hear was the wind, the crunch of her boots on loose rock, and the frantic beating of her own heart. The isolation was a physical presence, a heavy cloak settling over her. This was the land no one wanted, the place where things ended. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, she finally saw it. The ridge was a bleak spine of granite thrusting out of the earth, its slopes littered with scree and skeletal trees. And there, just as Mr. Gable had described, was a sunken depression in the hillside. It was a scar on the land, a dark, uninviting hollow lined with massive, roughly hewn stones. The heavy wooden door that had once sealed it lay in a heap of splintered, rotting timbers, half buried in dirt and weeds. It looked less like a structure and more like a grave. A cold dread, far colder than the wind, washed over Ilara. She sank to her knees, the heavy tools clattering to the ground. The weight of her supplies was nothing compared to the crushing weight of despair. They were right. The whole town was right. Her stepmother hadn't given her a deed. She had given her a death sentence. This wasn't a shelter. It was an open wound in the earth, a place to crawl into and be forgotten. Tears she had refused to shed in town now stung her eyes, hot against her freezing skin. For a long, silent moment, she believed it was over. But the cold was relentless. It seeped through her clothes, into her bones, a stark reminder that sitting still was the same as giving up. Shivering, driven by the last flickering ember of defiance, she got to her feet. She would at least see the entirety of her inheritance. She picked up the shovel and began to clear the debris from the entrance. The rotten wood was heavy with moisture, the earth beneath it packed hard. It was clumsy, exhausting work. As she dug deeper, clearing the stone threshold, she noticed something strange. The wind, which had been a constant, howling presence on the ridge, was gone. Here, in the mouth of the stone hollow, the air was utterly still. She held up her hand and felt nothing. Curiosity warred with her despair. She pushed aside the last of the broken timbers and peered into the blackness within. A draft of air breathed out from the opening, and it was not the biting cold of the ridge. It was cool, yes, but it was a cellar cool, a deep earth stillness free of the wind's savage bite. She took a hesitant step inside, her eyes struggling to adjust. The darkness was absolute. She fumbled for a match, struck it against a stone, and held the tiny flame aloft. The space that revealed itself was vast, far larger than she had imagined. It was a rectangular cavern carved directly from the heart of the hill, perhaps 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough for a tall man to stand upright. The walls were solid granite, the same bedrock as the ridge itself, dry and immense. The floor was not stone, but deep, dark earth. And at the very back of the chamber, a sound, a slow, rhythmic drip. Shielding the match, she walked to the far wall. A tiny, glistening thread of water wept from a fissure in the rock, falling into a small puddle on the ground below. It was clean, clear, and constant. Water. Inside. Protected. Then she felt it, the true secret of the place. The immense tonnage of rock and soil that surrounded her on all sides acted as a massive insulator. The hostile world of wind and ice was outside. In here was a profound, unshakable calm. Despair did not vanish, but it retreated, replaced by a grim, ferocious spark of resolve. This wasn't a grave. It was a fortress. The first days were a blur of brutal, unrelenting labor. Ilara's world shrank to the simple, agonizing tasks needed to turn the cavern from a hole into a home. Her first priority was a door. The wind was her enemy, a thief that stole warmth and energy. Using her father's axe, she attacked the stunted, hardy pines that clung to the lower slopes. The axe, once a familiar tool for splitting firewood, felt alien and heavy as she swung it against living wood. The shock of each blow traveled up her arms, jarring her to the bone. Her hands, soft from a life of farm chores, blistered within the first hour. By the end of the day, the blisters had broken, leaving her palms raw and bleeding. She tore strips from her petticoat to wrap them, her jaw tight with pain, and kept chopping. She dragged the logs back to the entrance, her muscles screaming in protest. They were not perfect, but they were solid. She spent 2 days hewing them into rough planks with the axe, a clumsy but effective form of carpentry. She scavenged the rusted hinges and nails from the old rotten door, straightening each one with a rock. Assembling the door was a battle of leverage and sheer will. When it was finally hung, it was ugly and crude, but it was thick, and it swung shut with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing the wind outside. That first moment of stillness inside, with the door closed, was a victory so profound it felt like a miracle. Next was fire. Without heat, the shelter was just a cold tomb. A conventional chimney was impossible. She could not dig through 20 feet of solid earth and rock. Her gaze fell upon the fissure at the back of the cavern, the one that provided her water. It was too small, but it snaked upwards into the darkness. She spent a week with a pry bar she fashioned from a tough branch and a heavy rock, chipping away at the stone around the base of the fissure, widening it into a crude opening for a hearth. She found a deposit of clay near the seep, thick and gray. She mixed it with dry grass, just as her father had done to patch their cottage chimney, and began to build. She mortared flat stones together, creating a firebox and a flue that channeled smoke into the natural fissure. The work was slow, painstaking, and filthy. She was caked in mud and stone dust, her body a single continuous ache. The day she lit the first fire was a day of judgment. She piled dry kindling and a few small logs into the hearth, her heart pounding. With a trembling hand, she struck a match. The kindling caught, and a plume of smoke rose. For a terrifying moment, it billowed back into the cavern, stinging her eyes and choking her. She thought she had failed. But then, as if the cavern itself were taking its first breath, a draft caught. The smoke swirled and was drawn upward, disappearing into the fissure. It worked. The smoke was venting, invisibly, somewhere on the top of the barren ridge. She fed the fire, and a wave of radiant heat began to push back against the deep chill of the stone. Ilara sat before her small, sputtering fire, tears of exhaustion and relief carving clean tracks through the grime on her face. She was warm. She was safe. With the essential elements of shelter and heat secured, she turned to her other systems. She used the shovel to deepen the area beneath the water seep, creating a small cistern. She lined it meticulously with the same clay she'd used for the fireplace, packing it down until it was watertight. Now she had a reservoir of clean, fresh water, a few feet from her fire. Her most ambitious project was the garden. The deep, loamy soil on the cavern floor was a blessing. It was shielded from the frost that was now silvering the world outside each morning. But it was in total darkness. On a risky trip down to the base of the ridge, she found a small, sheltered copse of aspens. For days, she hauled sacks of rich, black leaf mold up the slope and spread it over designated beds inside the cavern. She planted her seed potatoes and a few hardy carrot seeds she had. For light, she needed a miracle. She found it in the form of a small, thick piece of glass from a broken lantern, which she had picked up on the road, thinking it might be useful. Above her garden beds, she noticed the rock ceiling was thinner. She spent another week of back-breaking labor, chipping and digging upwards, creating a narrow shaft to the surface. She framed the top with flat stones and sealed the piece of glass over it with a thick layer of clay. It was a tiny, precious skylight. It let in only a sliver of pale, gray daylight, but in the gloom of the cave it was enough. It was a promise of life. Finally, it was time to return to Promise Creek. She needed protein, something that could live and reproduce. She dreaded the walk, But even more, she dreaded the faces of the people who had cast her out. When she walked into Mr. Gable's mercantile, the handful of customers fell silent. She was thinner, her face smudged with soot, her hands wrapped in stained rags, but her eyes held a new hardness. "I need 3 laying hens and a goat," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. Mr. Gable stared at her as if she were a ghost. "A goat? Child, where in God's name are you keeping a goat?" "That's my business," she replied, counting out the last of her silver dollars. "A pregnant one, if you have it." A man leaning against the counter, a burly trapper named Brant, let out a loud laugh. "A goat for the hole in the ground," he boomed. "What's next, Ice Girl? Planting corn in the dark?" The name stuck instantly. A few people snickered. The Ice Girl. Gable shook his head in pity and took her money. The journey back was even harder than the first. Leading a stubborn, pregnant goat and carrying 3 squawking chickens in a crate tested the very limits of her endurance. Halfway up the ridge, a scruffy, half-starved dog with wary eyes began to follow her, keeping its distance. It was drawn by the scent of the animals, but it made no move to attack. It just watched. Feeling a pang of kinship for this fellow outcast, Ilara tossed it a piece of the hard bread she had. The dog snatched it and retreated, but it continued to follow. By the time she reached her shelter, the dog was sitting 20 yards from the entrance, a silent, lonely sentinel. She named him Shadow. He was the final piece of her new world, a loyal companion in her solitary kingdom. That night, with the animals settled in a pen she had built in a corner of the cavern, the fire crackling, and Shadow asleep by the door, Ilara felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt she was home. The name the town had given her, the Ice Girl, became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered over fence posts and in the pews after Sunday service. Brant, the trapper, made it his personal mission to perpetuate the joke. He would sometimes ride his horse along the base of Whisperwind Ridge and shout up towards the unseen shelter. "How's the ice farm, girl? Harvested any icicles today?" His laughter would echo against the rocks, a sound of casual cruelty. Ilara heard him, but she never answered. Her world had shrunk to the stone walls of her cavern, and his mockery was just another noise from a life she no longer belonged to. As autumn bled into winter, a deep and profound routine took hold. Her days were governed by the rhythms of survival. She would wake in the deep, firelit dark, the only light coming from the glowing embers in her hearth. Her first task was always the fire, feeding it logs from the massive stack she had accumulated, a wall of wood that represented months of grueling labor. Then came the animals. The goat, now heavy with kid, would nicker softly for its morning ration of dried grasses she had painstakingly gathered. The chickens would cluck, demanding their small measure of grain. Their simple, living sounds were a comfort against the immense silence of the mountain. After tending to the animals, she would check her garden. In the pale, ethereal light from her tiny skylight, the green shoots of her carrots and the broad leaves of her potato plants looked like jewels. It was a secret, impossible garden, thriving in the heart of a stone mountain. Watering it with fresh, cold water from her cistern was a daily ritual that felt like an act of prayer. The world outside was dying, succumbing to frost and snow. But in her subterranean haven, life persisted. Her world was a stark contrast of warmth and cold, life and death. Inside was the steady heat of the fire, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, the soft sounds of her animals, and the miracle of her green, growing things. Outside was a world of screaming wind and biting cold. She spent her days mending her worn clothes, sharpening her axe, setting snare lines for rabbits in the scrub below the ridge, and processing what she caught. Every task was essential. There was no room for error, no time for despair. Her solitude was absolute, broken only by the quiet, constant presence of Shadow, who rarely left her side. Winter began to test her systems. The first real test came not from cold, but from water. A week of unseasonably warm rain sent torrents of water cascading down the ridge. She woke one night to the sound of a stream pouring through a newly opened crack near the entrance. Her lean-to was flooding. For hours, in the driving rain and darkness, she dug a diversion trench with her shovel, her hands numb, her body soaked, channeling the water away from her door. The system held. She had learned a valuable lesson about the power of water and the need for vigilance. A greater test came in the form of a pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of her goat. They came one night, their howls echoing off the cliffs, a sound of primal hunger. Shadow erupted in a frenzy of barking, his body pressed against the thick wooden door. Elara grabbed the axe, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear them scratching and clawing at the wood, throwing their weight against it. But the door, born of her own blistered hands, was solid. The stone walls were impassable. The wolves could circle and howl, but they could not get in. After a long, terrifying hour, they moved on, their cries fading into the distance. She leaned against the door, shaking, but her shelter had proven itself. It was not just a home, it was a fortress. Section, an early blizzard, a precursor to the main event, buried her entrance in 5 feet of snow. She spent 2 days digging her way out, a grueling task that left her exhausted, but strangely exhilarated. She was not trapped. She was merely inconvenienced. Her firewood was inside. Her food was inside. Her water was inside. The storm could rage, but it could not touch the core of her world. Each of these smaller trials hardened her, building a quiet confidence not in herself, but in the systems she had so painstakingly built. The mockery of the town, the memory of Brant's laughter, seemed to come from another lifetime. They did not know her. They did not know the world she commanded, this small, warm, living kingdom carved from a cold, dead stone. Then came the blizzard of '83. It did not arrive like a normal storm. It descended like a judgment. The sky, which had been a bruised purple for days, turned a sickening, milky white. The wind began not as a whistle, but as a low, guttural roar that grew in volume until it sounded like a freight train perpetually derailing just outside her door. Snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in blinding, horizontal sheets that erased the world. The temperature plummeted with an unnatural speed, dropping far below anything the old-timers in Promise Creek had ever spoken of. This was not weather. This was a physical assault. Inside her fortress of stone and earth, Elara felt the change more than she saw it. The deep, resonant hum of the wind vibrated through the rock itself. Her fire, drawing air through the fissure chimney, burned with a steady, defiant roar. The massive thermal mass of the surrounding hill, which had been slowly absorbing heat for months, now radiated it back, creating a stable, comfortable warmth. Her animals were calm, insulated from the sonic violence outside. The goat chewed its cud placidly. The chickens roosted, unperturbed. The slow drip of water into her cistern was an unwavering metronome marking time against the chaos. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach, an observer in a calm bubble at the heart of a hurricane of ice. In Promise Creek, the world was coming apart. The town, built with the confident but naive carpentry of the plains, was no match for the storm's fury. The wind, like a giant, invisible hand, peeled shingles from roofs and sent them spinning into the white maelstrom. The roof of the new church, the town's pride, groaned under the impossible weight of the snow and then collapsed with a sound that was swallowed by the wind. Families huddled in their homes, stuffing rags into the cracks around windows and doors, but the cold was an insidious predator, finding every weakness. Chimneys, built to handle normal winter snows, became clogged with ice, backing up and filling houses with blinding, choking smoke. People were forced to extinguish their fires, their only source of heat, or risk suffocation. Mr. Gable's mercantile, the symbol of the town's prosperity, suffered a mortal blow. The great pane-glass windows, his pride and joy, flexed under the wind's assault and then shattered inward, spraying glass across the store. The blizzard poured in, burying his stock of flour, sugar, and cloth under waves of snow, ruining everything. Firewood, stacked neatly in woodsheds and against the sides of houses, became buried under monumental drifts, inaccessible. The town's confidence, its very sense of order, shattered as quickly as Gable's windows. They were trapped, they were freezing, and their preparations were proving to be useless. It was on the third day of the storm that the sound came. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on her door. Elara froze, her hand hovering over the fire. No person could be out in this. It was impossible. Shadow was already at the door, not with the aggressive barking he used for wolves, but with a series of sharp, questioning yelps. The pounding came again, weaker this time, followed by a slumping sound. Hesitantly, she lifted the heavy bar securing the door and pulled it inward. A figure, so covered in snow and ice it was barely human, collapsed onto the floor of her cavern. It was a man. As she rolled him over and brushed the ice from his face, her breath caught in her throat. It was Brant, the trapper who had laughed at her, who had named her the Ice Girl. His face was a mask of waxy, white frostbite, his lips blue. He was barely conscious. She dragged him toward the fire, pulling off his frozen gloves to reveal hands that were alarmingly white. She began rubbing them with snow, the old way to bring back frozen flesh, her mind racing. What was he doing out here? He mumbled, his words slurring together through frozen lips. My boy. Sick. Fire's out. Woods. Gone. The story came out in broken pieces as she forced hot broth between his lips. His cabin was a mile away. The fever had taken his young son 2 days ago. Their firewood had run out that morning. He had set out in a desperate, suicidal attempt to get to his trap line, hoping to find a deadfall he could break up for wood. He had become disoriented in the whiteout, wandering blindly until he saw a faint, shimmering glow in the air, the heat rising from her invisible chimney. It was the only landmark in a featureless, howling world, and he had stumbled towards it as his last hope. His wife and sick child were alone in the freezing cabin, waiting. Elara looked at the man who represented all the scorn and mockery she had endured. He was helpless, broken, and at her mercy. A bitter, cold satisfaction flickered within her. This was justice. He had called her a fool, and now his life and the lives of his family depended on her foolishness. She thought of her carefully rationed firewood, her preserved food, the delicate balance of her survival. Helping him would put a significant strain on her resources. He deserved to be thrown back out into the storm he had so arrogantly underestimated. But then her mind conjured an image not of Brant, but of his child, a small boy she had seen once in town, wrapped in blankets in a freezing cabin. The choice was never really a choice. It was not about what Brant deserved. It was about what she could do. Her father had taught her that you measure your wealth not by what you have, but by what you can give away when it matters most. She stood up, her decision made. "We have to go back for them," she said, her voice firm. Brant looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and shame. She ignored him, already moving with purpose. She loaded a small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling firewood with logs, heavy wool blankets, a jar of broth, and a bundle of dried herbs for fever. She wrapped herself in every layer she owned, tying one end of a long rope to the heavy iron ring inside her door and the other around her own waist, she handed a second rope to Brant. "Hold on to this. Shadow will lead." The moment she opened the door, the storm consumed them. The wind was a solid wall, the snow a blinding vortex. It was impossible to see more than a foot ahead. But Shadow, his head low, seemed to scent the way, pulling against the rope that connected him to Elara. They moved as a single entity, a tiny, fragile island of life in an ocean of frozen chaos. The journey to Brant's cabin was a waking nightmare, a battle for every single step. Twice, Brant fell, his strength gone, and Elara had to haul him back to his feet, screaming encouragement that was instantly ripped away by the wind. She was no longer a girl. She was a force of nature as relentless as the storm itself, driven by a singular, stubborn purpose. When they finally stumbled through the door of Brant's cabin, the scene was one of quiet, cold despair. His wife was huddled over their son, trying to warm him with her own body heat. The child was pale and still, his breathing terrifyingly shallow. Without a word, Elara went to work. She and Brant built a fire with the wood they had brought, the flames catching with a desperate hunger. She heated the broth and gently forced it past the boy's lips. She wrapped him in the warm, dry blankets from her own home. For the rest of the night, she sat by his side, tending the fire, her presence a silent, steady anchor in the collapsing world of the Brant family. As dawn approached, the boys' fever broke. She brought them all back to the ice house. The journey was slow, but the worst of the storm had passed. When Brant's wife, Sarah, stepped through the door of Elara's home, she stopped dead, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, accustomed to the gray, freezing world of her own cabin, struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. They had stepped out of a world of death and into a world of impossible life. The first thing that hit them was the warmth, not the scorching, temporary heat of a desperate fire, but a deep, radiant warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Then their eyes adjusted to the firelight. They saw the neat pens holding a goat and several chickens, the animals calm and quiet. They saw the immense, orderly stack of firewood, a symbol of unimaginable security. But what truly stunned them into silence was the garden. In a corner of the cavern, under a faint, milky light from above, were rows of green, living plants. Carrots, potatoes, hardy greens, all thriving in the heart of a frozen mountain. Sarah began to weep, quiet, racking sobs of sheer, overwhelming relief and disbelief. The blizzard finally broke on the 5th day. The silence that fell over the land was as shocking as the noise had been. Soon, a small party of men from Promise Creek, led by Mr. Gable, made their way up the ridge, checking on the outlying homesteads. They assumed they were on a recovery mission, expecting to find the frozen body of the foolish girl who had tried to live in an ice house. They tracked Brant's desperate footprints and found their way to the entrance. Mr. Gable cautiously pushed open the door. He saw the fire, the animals, and Brant, his wife, and his recovering son, all safe. His gaze swept across the cavern, taking in the cistern, the tool rack, the stores of preserved food, and the impossible garden. He looked at Elara, who stood by the fire, her face calm, her eyes steady. She was no longer the waif he had offered a sweeping job to. She was the sovereign of this place, a creator of warmth and life in the middle of desolation. Gable took off his hat, his shoulders slumping. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with a humility he had never before shown. "We called it Gable's Folly," he said, his voice cracking. He looked around the cavern again, then back at her. "My God, Elara, we were the fools." Elara felt no triumph, no surge of vindication. Their shame was their own burden to carry. She had been too busy surviving to spare any energy for resentment. She simply picked up a ladle and gestured to the pot of soup simmering over the fire. "There is food," she said. "Eat." Then she pointed to the wall of firewood, Take what you need for your families." Her grace was a quiet, practical thing, more powerful than any words of accusation could ever be. It was the final, unassailable proof of her victory. In the aftermath of the Great Blizzard, the legend of the Ice Girl was rewritten. The name that had once been a term of mockery became a title of profound respect. Ellara's home on Whisperwind Ridge was no longer seen as a folly, but as a miracle of ingenuity and foresight. People from Promise Creek no longer avoided the ridge, they made pilgrimages to it. They came to trade for her impossible winter vegetables, her fresh eggs, and the goat's milk that followed the birth of 2 healthy kids. More than that, they came to learn. Men who had spent their lives building with wood stood in awe of her stone hearth and fissure chimney, asking her to explain the principles of thermal mass. Women came to see her subterranean garden, marveling at how she had coaxed life from the darkness. The relationship between Ellara and the town had been permanently transformed. Mr. Gable extended her unlimited credit at his mercantile, an apology in the form of commerce, which she accepted with quiet dignity, but rarely used. Brant, the trapper, became her fiercest ally, his debt to her a silent, powerful bond that he repaid with loyalty and protection. The community that had cast her out now depended on her knowledge for its own survival. The Blizzard of '83 became a defining event for the settlement, a harsh lesson written in ice and loss. The way they built their homes began to change. New structures were dug deeper into the hillsides, their foundations made of stone, not just wood. Root cellars were expanded and reinforced, becoming not just places for storage, but emergency shelters, their design inspired by Ellara's cavern. The story of the orphan girl who had tamed the mountain spread through the territories, carried by travelers and traders. It became a frontier legend, a testament to the power of resilience against overwhelming odds. Her methods, born of pure necessity, became principles of a new kind of architecture, one that worked with the land instead of merely sitting upon it. Years passed. The raw shelter in the hillside evolved into the heart of a small, thriving homestead. The lean-to at the entrance was replaced by a solid stone and timber workshop. The garden inside expanded, and she built a small protected greenhouse against the sun-facing side of the ridge. The lone goat became a small flock, their bleating a gentle sound against the wind. Ellara remained on her ridge, a quiet, steady presence. She never married, her solitude a habit she had no desire to break, though she was never truly alone. Shadow grew old and passed, but there was always a dog at her side, a descendant of the first stray who had found a kindred spirit in a lonely girl. One evening, now a woman whose age was etched not in years, but in wisdom, she stood outside her home, watching the sun set over the valley. Promise Creek glittered below, its lights a testament to a community that had learned and endured. Her home was no longer a place of exile, but a place of power, a symbol of an unbreakable will. She had been given nothing but a hole in the ground and the scorn of her neighbors. From that, she had built not just a shelter, but a life. Her legacy was not written in a will or carved on a tombstone. It was written in the stone walls that held back the cold, in the dark soil that gave forth life, and in the quiet strength that had turned the town's greatest folly into its most enduring lesson. That the things we discard as worthless often hold the deepest value, waiting only for the right hands and the right heart to bring it into the light.